an old combat veteran, and was leaving a bakery in the cold snow of Montana when a small voice stopped him, soft but steady. "Sir, can I have $10? My dog's bleeding bad. He saved me and I have to save him now." Jake Harmon turned. There she stood, a little girl no older than 8, curls tangled, her hoodie torn at the sleeves, one hand clutching a rope leash tied around the neck of a limping shepherd mix. Blood marked the snow behind them in quiet red drops. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stood firm, her eyes fierce with something too old for her face. Jake could have kept walking, told himself it wasn't his war, but he didn't. Because in that moment it wasn't just a dog that needed help. And it wasn't just $10. What happened next would lead to a custody battle, a secret voicemail, a courtroom that fell silent, and a bond no law could explain. Some families are chosen on the battlefield. Others begin on a frozen sidewalk, with a whistle around a little girl's neck and a dog who never forgot the way home. Setting: Mountain Pine, Montana. Late January. The sky a steel gray sheet stretched tight over a town frozen in silence. Snow, not fresh, but layered and pressed like memories too old to touch, blanketed the sidewalks and pine-covered hills. The wind didn't howl, it whispered, like something holding its breath. Jake Harmon stepped out of Cooper's bakery, the warmth of cinnamon still clinging faintly to his flannel-lined coat. He was tall, around 6'2", with shoulders that still held the memory of war even if the war had ended long ago. His sandy blonde hair, peppered with early gray, peeked out beneath a worn navy beanie, and a faint scar cut diagonally across his left eyebrow, a souvenir from Fallujah. Jake's gait was solid but carried weight, not just from the boots sunk half an inch in snow, but from something heavier that didn't show in bones or muscle. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just walking like he did most mornings, trying to stay moving. Ever since returning from deployment 6 years ago, he had made Mountain Pine his quiet place, a town where no one asked questions. A town where people let silence be a kindness. Jake was adjusting the paper bag in his gloved hand when he saw her. A little girl 8, maybe 9, was tugging hard on something in the crosswalk ahead. She was small and thin, wearing a gray hoodie several sizes too big, its sleeves dragging like torn flags. Her jeans were stiff with frost near the hem, and one of her sneakers had the toe busted open. Her hair was wild curly and straw blonde, with tangles that caught snowflakes like tiny knots of glitter. But it wasn't just the girl that stopped him, it was the dog. A large shepherd mix mud-colored fur clinging to matted patches, his right hind leg dragging with every movement. Blood dotted the snow beneath him in dark, melting splashes. Despite the pain, the dog moved with her, eyes fixed forward, muzzle pressed close to her hip like a shadow that refused to let go. Jake froze. The girl saw him watching. She tightened her grip on the rope looped around the dog's neck-makeshift leash, frayed and knotted. Her voice, when she spoke, was not pleading, but steady, the kind that had practiced being brave too many times. "Sir," she said, "do you have $10? Rusty's leg is real bad, and I need to get him to the feed store. They got some powder that might help, and I don't got enough." Jake looked at her, really looked. Her cheeks were windburned, freckled with grime, but her eyes were piercingly blue. Not the sky blue of storybooks, but something deeper, like a lake that's been frozen over but still watches. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stood there, waiting, as the dog swayed on 3 legs behind her. Jake reached into his coat without speaking and pulled out his wallet. His hands moved slow, careful, as if too sudden a gesture might spook her. He handed her a crisp $10 bill. "Thank you," she said, and bowed her head slightly like someone had taught her old manners. Then she turned and kept walking. No hesitation, no looking back. Rusty, the dog, limped alongside her, his fur brushing her side. Jake didn't move, not at first, but something about the way the dog looked at him as he passed, those amber eyes, dulled by exhaustion but still bright with something like trust, anchored him to the ground. Jake had seen eyes like that in the sandbox, in the quiet after a blast, on the soldiers who didn't speak but needed you to understand anyway. He watched them disappear past the corner bakery, then hesitated only a second more before falling in step behind them, his boots quiet on the snow. They didn't notice him. The girl walked quickly, weaving through alleyways and behind shuttered shops like someone who had learned which shadows were safest. Rusty struggled but never made a sound, only stumbled once, and she stopped to let him rest, pressing a hand to his ribs like a silent apology. Jake trailed at a distance, unnoticed, heart kicking a little faster. He didn't know what he was doing. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe instinct, or maybe it was that damn dog and those eyes that wouldn't leave him alone. The girl led Rusty to the edge of town, where the neat cabins turned to sagging porches and trailer homes with boarded windows. She turned down a narrow gravel path, mostly ice now, and reached a small green shed attached to an abandoned auto garage. The door had no lock, just a chain looped loosely around the handle. She looked around once. Jake ducked behind a rusted pickup frame, crouching low. Then the girl unwrapped the chain and disappeared inside with Rusty. A few moments later, the sound of movement, then silence. Jake waited. The wind picked up again, brushing snow off the hood of the truck and into his collar. He didn't know her name, didn't know what business an 8-year-old had living in a half-frozen shed with a bleeding dog. But he knew one thing. Something wasn't right. He stood up slowly, eyes still fixed on the shed, snow falling soft against his coat. That's when he noticed it, a line of blood on the snow leading up to the doorway. A dark crimson trail, still fresh. Jake took a deep breath and stepped forward. The next morning, the clouds hung low and metallic over Mountain Pine, casting a gray hush across the town as if the sky itself was holding back something unspoken. The snowfall had stopped sometime after midnight, but the temperature had plummeted, turning the world brittle and sharp. Jake Harmon stood across the street, back pressed to the cold brick wall of an old laundromat, watching the green shed from a distance. His breath fogged the air in slow, measured exhales. He'd stayed there most of the night. The girl hadn't left. No sign of life from inside, no flicker of light, not even a plume of smoke from the small chimney, which suggested the building had no working stove. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his heavy coat, his boots leaving faint prints in the snow. The paper bag in his hand held a sandwich, 2 granola bars, and a bottle of apple juice. Nothing gourmet, but warm, wrapped in foil. He crossed the street. Quietly, Jake laid the bag near the door beside a pile of cracked bricks. He didn't knock. He didn't say a word, just backed away, turning on his heel before he could talk himself into doing more. But that night, around 1:00 a.m., he was woken by a sound that cut straight through the walls of his cabin on Birch Road. A long, drawn-out howl, not the kind coyotes make. This one was deeper, raw, rusty. Jake bolted upright, pulling on his coat and boots in seconds. He didn't bother with gloves. By the time he reached the shed, snow was falling again, light but persistent. The same howl echoed out into the cold again, cracking midway like it was fighting itself. Jake banged on the door. "Sophie." No response. He tried the handle. Locked. Another whimper. Then silence. He backed up, kicked once, just below the knob, and the old wood splintered open with a groan. The interior hit him like a punch. The walls were bare and moldy, insulation torn, cardboard sheets stuffed between broken windows. A candle burned low in a peanut butter jar, giving off a sickly yellow glow. There was no furniture except an overturned milk crate, a ripped-up sleeping bag, and a few stacked crates as shelves. On one of them sat a cracked plastic bowl half full of dry cereal. Sophie was curled up in the corner, asleep under layers of old clothes and a canvas sheet. Her hair fanned out like a halo of tangled gold. Beside her, Rusty lay trembling, legs swollen and bleeding anew, his breathing shallow. Jake moved carefully, crouched by the dog. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Rusty blinked, let out a faint whine, and licked Jake's wrist. Then Sophie stirred. She opened her eyes, not startled, but wary, like someone who had learned not to cry out even when scared. "You broke in," she said softly, sitting up. "You needed help," Jake replied. She didn't answer, just looked at Rusty and then back at Jake as if measuring how far to trust him. "Where's your mom?" Jake asked. The girl hesitated. Then very quietly she said, "She died last winter, in her sleep. I covered her with my coat, but she didn't wake up. I think she was just too tired." Jake sat back, heart twisting. "Your dad?" Her voice sharpened like a snap in dry wood. "Gone. Police took him. He wasn't nice." Jake didn't ask more. Her tone had said enough. "I've been here since. We were squatting here even before," she added. "Rusty found me a week after. He just showed up. I think God sent him." Jake looked at Rusty again. The dog was young, maybe 4-5 years old, a German Shepherd mix with thick, russet-brown fur streaked with grime. He had one bent ear and a scar under his left eye. He looked like a dog who had belonged to someone once, someone who didn't deserve him. Jake took off his coat and laid it over Sophie. "You're not staying here another night." She didn't argue. She just nodded and laid her head back down on Rusty's side. Meanwhile, across town, Deputy Nora Finley sat at her desk at the Mountain Pine Sheriff's Office, flipping through missing juvenile reports. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-featured with deep brown eyes and a presence that was quiet but firm. Her hair was cut just above the shoulders, always neatly combed, always practical. Nora had grown up in foster care after her own parents disappeared in a snowstorm when she was 12, an event that left her with a kind of vigilance most people mistook for coldness. But tonight, something felt off. She'd received a tip 2 days ago from a delivery driver, said he'd seen a little girl carrying a dog through town during the coldest week of the year. No adult in sight. No address. Just the girl. Small. Alone. Near the old Greystone garage. Nora stood, pulled on her uniform jacket, and called over to dispatch. "I'm checking out the Greystone property. Bring backup if you don't hear from me in 30. Back at the shed, Jake had gathered what little belongings Sophie had. A threadbare backpack, a plastic photo frame with a woman smiling in summer sunlight, and a small tin whistle on a frayed string. The whistle she clutched tightly as Jake lifted her into the passenger seat of his truck. Rusty lay in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket Jake kept for emergencies. They drove in silence for several minutes. Jake didn't take her to the hospital. Not yet. He brought her to his own cabin, modest, one-story, cedar-paneled, tucked between pines like it didn't want to be noticed. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and coffee. He laid Rusty gently on a rug by the fireplace, lit a fire, and gave Sophie his spare flannel shirt to wear. "You're safe now," he said. She didn't speak, just nodded, clutching the whistle. Outside, the snow thickened, and not long after, a patrol cruiser pulled up the gravel path to Jake's cabin. Deputy Finley stepped out, flashlight in hand. She knocked once. Jake opened the door. Nora stared at him, then glanced past his shoulder, at Sophie, at Rusty. "You found her," she said simply. Jake nodded. "She found me, really." Nora exhaled. "We've been trying to track her down. Welfare system flagged her 6 months ago, but the file got lost in transition." "She's not going back into the system," Jake said immediately. Nora raised an eyebrow. "You got paperwork for that?" "No, just responsibility." She studied him for a long moment, then looked at Sophie. "I'll give you a few days," she said. "But someone from the county will come knocking, and when they do, they won't be this kind." Nora turned and walked back through the snow, her boots crunching softly. Jake closed the door, and for the first time in a long while, the silence in his cabin didn't feel empty. The next morning arrived not with sun, but with light that seemed to tiptoe through the blinds. Jake Harmon stood by the stove in his cabin, pouring hot water into a chipped enamel mug. Steam curled up and vanished into the wooden rafters, mixing with the scent of pine, ash, and the faint citrus of dish soap. Behind him, a slow, tentative shuffling sound announced Sophie's presence. She was wearing one of Jake's flannel shirts that hung like a blanket on her small frame. The sleeves rolled clumsily above her elbows. Her hair, though still tangled, had been brushed with an effort only a child could make with a borrowed comb. Rusty lay curled by the hearth, his injured leg wrapped in clean gauze. The dog's breathing had evened out overnight, and the dull shine in his amber eyes now held something else: recognition, maybe even gratitude. His ears perked slightly as Sophie approached, and she dropped to her knees beside him, tucking her toes beneath her. Around her neck hung the little tin whistle on a blue string, dull and dented, the edges worn smooth by years of touch. Jake watched her from the kitchen, arms folded. "That whistle, was it your mom's?" Sophie looked up and nodded. "She gave it to me the day she got sick. Said if anything ever happened, I could blow it and she'd find her way back." "She was smart," Jake said softly, his eyes resting on the whistle a moment longer before shifting to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but it had left behind thick drifts that curved like waves along the fence. The world looked calm, almost untouched, but Jake knew better than most how still things could hide the most chaos underneath. "Come on," he said, holding out a small notebook. "Let's try some letters. You know how to write your name?" "Only the S," Sophie replied with a tiny shrug. Jake pulled out a pencil. "Let's fix that." They sat at the old kitchen table, Rusty sleeping beside them, and for the first time in a long while, the cabin felt lived in. Jake showed her how to make the curves of each letter, sometimes guiding her hand, sometimes just watching. Sophie's face crinkled in concentration, her tongue peeking out between her lips as she slowly wrote Sophie Caldwell across the page. When she finished, she grinned, holding it up like it was a trophy. Later, Jake taught her how to boil water safely using the kettle, how to stir oatmeal without burning the bottom of the pot. He watched her grow a little taller with each task, her shoulders straighter, her voice a little louder. The whistle never left her neck, swinging slightly with each movement. In the afternoon, Jake sat at his desk near the window and made the call he'd been avoiding. The county clerk's office transferred him 3 times before someone finally answered. "I'm looking into legal guardianship for a minor," Jake said. "Her name is Sophie Caldwell, 8 years old." The voice on the other end, an older man with a weary tone, asked for basic information. Jake gave what he knew. Then came the silence. "There's no birth certificate filed under that name in the county database," the clerk finally said. "Are you sure about the spelling?" Jake frowned. "Caldwell. That's what she told me. Her mother's name was—" He paused, glancing toward Sophie, who was now feeding Rusty a piece of dry bread. "Megan Caldwell. She died last year. They were squatting near the Greystone lot." Another pause. "We have a file here," the clerk said carefully, "but it's sealed under judicial request. There's a note attached. Says the maternal family filed a motion for custody and asset control 3 months ago. The minor was listed as missing. Name of the petitioner, Patricia Kessler." Jake's stomach sank. Patricia Kessler. He knew that name. Not personally, but it came with a reputation. Patricia was Megan Caldwell's mother, Sophie's maternal grandmother, and a woman known across Mountain Pine's upper circles for her money, her pristine reputation, and her merciless efficiency. A former county judge, long retired, with short silver blonde hair and a thin-lipped smile that never quite reached her pale green eyes. She was tall, angular, and always wore a brooch shaped like a starburst pinned to her coat. Locals whispered that her rulings in the courtroom had been cold but precise, like a scalpel. Jake had no doubt she'd fight for custody, not out of love, but control. "Where's the hearing?" Jake asked. "District Court, Missoula," the clerk replied. 3 weeks from today. But if she gets an emergency ruling..." Jake didn't let him finish. He ended the call, his pulse thudding harder than it had in years. Not even Fallujah had felt this unpredictable. Meanwhile, across the county line in an office lined with law books and leather, Patricia Kessler sat behind a wide oak desk. Her fingers, long and pale, tapped lightly against the ivory telephone receiver. "Find the girl," she said coldly into the line. "She's alive. I want her found before the hearing. I won't let Megan's foolish legacy turn into another backwoods embarrassment." Her assistant, Clara Winslow, stood quietly to the side. Clara was in her early 40s, prim in a gray pantsuit and black-rimmed glasses, with a face that had learned to stay neutral through decades of secrets. She didn't agree with Patricia's methods, but she never objected. That wasn't part of her job. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. That evening, Jake paced the living room, phone in hand, flipping through contacts he hadn't used in years. Most of them were long-gone old Army friends, a few caseworkers he knew from volunteering with veterans. But then he found it. Nora Finley. He called. "You heard of Patricia Kessler?" he asked the moment she picked up. A pause. "Unfortunately. Why?" "She filed for custody of Sophie. I just got confirmation. I need your help." "You thinking of fighting it?" Nora asked. Jake glanced at Sophie, curled up by the fire, sketching something with crayons on an old newspaper. She was humming softly. Her whistle lay beside her, shining faintly in the light. "I'm not thinking," he said. "I'm doing it." The courthouse in Missoula stood like a sandstone relic in the heart of town. Its arched windows and twin oak doors frosted by the late February air. Inside, the central courtroom felt too large for the few people present that morning, its high ceiling echoing every movement, every whisper. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of wooden benches polished by time and tension. Jake Harmon sat alone at the front defense table, hands clenched, the sleeves of his worn gray coat frayed at the elbows. His shoulders, broad and straight-backed in combat, now carried a nervous stillness that betrayed the weight of what he was about to face. He had shaved for the first time in a week, trimmed his beard to a stubble, and wore his old church shirt, pale blue, with a faint stain on the hem he hadn't noticed until this morning. His eyes, though tired, were alert, vigilant in a way that had never left him since war. To his right, Sophie sat on a cushion someone had brought in for her. She clutched the tin whistle around her neck like a talisman. Her jeans were patched at the knees, her boots scuffed. Despite Jake's gentle words that morning, she had refused to smile. She simply waited. So did Rusty, lying at her feet, the fresh bandages on his hind legs still stiff but clean. His gaze followed everything. Then the courtroom door creaked open. Carolyn Owens stepped through with a lawyer at her side. She was in her early 60s, tall and reed-thin, with a sharp face built on angles, hair dyed a precise ash blonde, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of dry-cleaning chemicals. Carolyn had been Patricia Kessler's personal attorney for years. Her reputation was made not in passion, but precision, cold logic, always within the law, rarely within the heart. Behind her, Clara Winslow, Patricia's assistant, followed without a word. Clara wore a slate-gray skirt suit and carried a manila folder pressed tightly against her chest. Her eyes darted to Sophie and softened just slightly before quickly hardening again. Judge Alan Brewster entered last, a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with thick white eyebrows and a deep voice that rarely rose above conversational. Known for his measured patience, he had a habit of pausing mid-sentence and looking over his glasses, as if letting silence do more than words ever could. "Let's begin," he said simply. Carolyn stood, her voice clipped and polished. "Your Honor, the Caldwell estate is concerned with the safety and well-being of the minor child, Sophie Caldwell, currently under the unofficial care of Mr. Jake Harmon. Mr. Harmon is unmarried, has no direct blood relation to the child, no stable income outside occasional contracting, and, per military discharge papers, has a documented history of post-traumatic stress disorder." Jake didn't flinch. He had prepared for this. Carolyn continued, "Furthermore, the maternal grandmother, the Honorable Patricia Kessler, has expressed a clear desire to reunite with her granddaughter to preserve family ties and provide the child with structure, inheritance protection, and access to education and medical care." Judge Brewster turned to Jake. "Mr. Harmon, would you like to respond?" Jake stood slowly. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "Sophie didn't just find a place to sleep in my cabin. She found a place where someone listens when she talks, where she eats 3 times a day, where her dog gets his wound cleaned, and where she can sleep through the night without someone shouting or leaving." He glanced at Sophie. She wasn't just abandoned, she was erased. No birth certificate, no records, no visits from her family. And now, when her mother's gone, they want her back. For what? Carolyn rose again. "Emotional appeals are understandable, Your Honor, but irrelevant." Sophie, silent until now, blinked rapidly, tears building behind her lashes. Jake started to speak again, but before he could, a sound echoed through the room, a low, trembling howl. Rusty had raised his head and was letting out a noise not of warning or aggression, but of grief, the kind of sound only a dog who's seen loss can make. The room stilled. Even Carolyn's lips parted slightly, caught off guard. Rusty rose, dragging his bad leg, and slowly limped forward until he stood between Jake and Sophie, eyes locked on Carolyn. He didn't bark. He just stood there, shaking, tail still, breathing hard. Sophie buried her face into her hands. Then the courtroom doors opened once more. Deputy Nora Finley entered, her badge gleaming under her dark forest green winter coat. She walked with the kind of stride that didn't ask for permission. In her gloved hands, she held a flash drive. Her eyes, brown and sharp, scanned the room and landed on the judge. "Permission to submit new evidence, Your Honor," she said. "This came into my hands last night. It's a voicemail recording Carolyn Owens left on a private legal line regarding this case." Carolyn stiffened. Judge Brewster leaned forward. "Play it." Nora plugged the drive into the court laptop. The audio played clearly through the speakers. Carolyn's voice, cool, clinical, filled the room. I don't care if the girl's better off with the soldier. Patricia needs her under her roof. There are land rights in Idaho that tie to Megan's estate. Without the child under her control, the trust locks. Just get me that damn custody order. I'll handle the PR fallout if it leaks. Silence. Heavy. Dense. Carolyn didn't speak. Neither did Clara, who slowly set the manila folder down and looked away. Judge Brewster folded his hands, eyebrows raised. Ms. Owens, do you dispute the authenticity of this recording? She swallowed hard. No, Your Honor. Jake exhaled, but Sophie had already moved, rushing from her chair and hugging Rusty around the neck. The dog let out a huff of relief. Judge Brewster's voice softened. In light of this evidence and the testimony observed here today, I will be issuing a formal order granting Mr. Harmon temporary guardianship pending a final review. Full custody will be considered with testimony from character witnesses and child services review. Carolyn tried to speak, but Brewster raised a hand. This court will not be leveraged for asset management, he said flatly. Motion adjourned. The gavel fell. Outside the courthouse, the air had shifted. Still cold, but gentler, like something had finally cracked through the frost. Jake and Sophie stood by the truck, Nora beside them. You did good, Nora said, adjusting her gloves. I had help. Jake nodded toward her, then to Rusty, who was already curled up in the back seat again, eyes half closed. Sophie turned to Nora. Can I blow the whistle now? Nora smiled. You don't have to. We already heard you. The wind was wild that night in Mountain Pine, rattling the shutters and whistling through pine needles like a restless spirit unsure where to settle. Jake Harmon sat in a chair by the fireplace, staring into the flickering light like it might hold answers he'd been chasing his whole life. The warmth licked at his boots, at the stitched hem of his old jeans, at the calloused fingers resting on his knees. His flannel shirt, the same one he'd worn when the judge gave him temporary custody of Sophie Caldwell, smelled faintly of smoke and sawdust, reminders of his hands always needing something to fix. Across the room, curled under a quilt on the worn-out couch, Sophie stirred in her sleep. Her breathing was slow but unsteady, occasionally broken by a quiet whimper that pulled Jake's attention like a tug on his chest. She'd been having dreams lately. Not nightmares in the classic sense, no screaming, no jolts awake, but the kind of dreams that leaked sadness into the room like spilled water, soaking everything. Rusty, stretched out on the rug near the fire, lifted his head at the sound, his ears twitching. His injured leg had improved, though he still limped. Jake had learned by now the dog didn't bark much, didn't whine or beg either, but his eyes said everything, deep amber, watchful, and always resting on Sophie like she was a fragile thread he meant to guard until the world stopped pulling. Jake watched them both. He'd filed the paperwork that afternoon. Nora Finley had helped him find the forms at the county records office, a plain building with creaky radiators and bitter coffee. She had worn her sheriff's deputy jacket, but her manner had softened. You sure? She'd asked while handing him the pen. He hadn't answered right away. I'm not a parent, he finally muttered, signing anyway. Now, back at the cabin, the weight of that decision burned heavier than the fire. He rose slowly, walking to the kitchen where the counter held the tin whistle Sophie always wore during the day. She'd taken it off before falling asleep, first time she had done so in weeks. Jake picked it up. It was warm from her skin, dented, the mouthpiece slightly bent. And suddenly something cracked inside him, not loud, not sudden, but deep. He returned to the chair and stared at it in his hand. He had been trained to survive, to march, shoot, repair, heal, endure. But nothing in boot camp had taught him how to be chosen by someone so small, so quiet, who asked for nothing except to stay. Sophie murmured something in her sleep then. Jake leaned in, barely breathing. Don't make me go, please, she whispered. Jake's my house now. Jake's chest tightened like a fist had reached in and wrapped around his ribs. He exhaled hard, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, the whistle still clutched in his palm. The next morning, the snow had melted slightly under the rare touch of sun, revealing patches of frozen mud near the porch steps. Jake pulled on his jacket and boots, left Rusty dozing by the fire, and made his way to the town hall. He didn't stop at the diner, didn't wave at old Mr. Calder, who was shoveling salt into the sidewalk cracks. Inside, the town clerk's office smelled of lemon cleaner and dry paper. A young woman behind the counter looked up, short red hair, glasses too large for her face, and a floral scarf knotted neatly at her neck. Her name tag read, Linda Graham. Hi there, Filing or retrieval? She asked with a kind voice, though her tone suggested she hadn't spoken to more than 3 people all day. Jake cleared his throat. Guardianship petition, permanent, for Sophie Caldwell. Linda blinked, then smiled with soft surprise. Oh, we've been waiting on that. Deputy Finley called ahead this morning. Jake nodded slowly. She did? She said you'd come in, said you'd get over the fear before the coffee wore off. Linda winked, sliding the folder across the desk. She's got good instincts. Jake filled out the paperwork in silence, every letter a commitment, every checkbox a promise. At one point his hand trembled, and Linda offered him a small rubber grip for the pen. You okay? She asked gently. I'm terrified, he admitted. That usually means you're about to do something right, she said with a shrug. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Sophie was sitting cross-legged by the fireplace, drawing with a pack of crayons Jake had picked up last week at the feed store. She was sketching a house one that looked a lot like theirs. Slanted roof, smoke rising from the chimney, a dog in the yard, 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. She titled it, Home, for real this time. Rusty, alert again, stood and walked to the kitchen window, letting out a soft grumble. Sophie followed him and peered outside, but the porch was empty. She stepped out, shivering slightly, only to find something tucked behind the stacked firewood, a box wrapped in old butcher paper. She carried it inside, curious, fingers careful. Inside was a frame, wooden, a bit chipped but clean, and in it a photo, her mother Megan Caldwell holding her as a baby, both of them laughing. Sophie's eyes widened. It was the only picture she had of her mother smiling. At the bottom corner was a note in Jake's handwriting. You look like her when you smile. That evening Jake returned. Sophie met him at the door holding the frame like it was glass spun from magic. Where did you get this? She asked. Jake crouched in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I stopped by the records office a while ago, he said. They had a storage bin of unclaimed items from evictions. I dug through until I found it. Thought maybe you'd like it. Sophie nodded slowly, then hugged him, arms around his neck, tiny hands gripping the back of his coat. Did you do it? She asked into his shoulder. Jake pulled back and smiled, tired but full. Yeah, I did it. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew, and for the first time in Jake's life, the word home meant something that couldn't be burned down, or bombed, or left behind. It meant her. It had been almost exactly 1 year since the wind first carried Sophie Caldwell's voice across Jake Harmon's path. Now, in the golden lull of a Montana summer, the pine trees no longer whispered secrets, they sang them. The fields surrounding the Clearwater Youth Camp shimmered with sunflowers and wild grass, the mountain air light and alive with the smell of warm soil and pine sap. Laughter floated through the air like dandelion seeds, rising from clusters of children scattered across the clearing where the counselors had organized that afternoon's game. Jake stood a little apart from the group, leaning against a post near the mess tent. His arms were crossed, one ankle hooked over the other, a straw Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His beard had grown out a little again, and his old denim shirt, faded and sun-creased, was open over a plain white tee. He watched Sophie from afar, letting her have the space she'd earned. She was nearly 9 now. Taller, sturdier, though still wearing the same whistle around her neck. Her sun-bleached curls were tied back in a loose braid, and a small scar above her right eyebrow, barely visible now, remained as one of the few physical remnants of that long winter. She wore shorts, a blue camp shirt, and sneakers that looked like they'd seen every trail in the woods. There was dirt under her fingernails and bug bites on her calves, and she was smiling. Not nervously, not with effort, but openly, naturally, like a girl who finally knew she belonged somewhere. Beside her sat Rusty. He was slower these days, his hind leg amputated below the knee after an infection last spring, but he'd survived the surgery with the same stubborn loyalty he always carried. The staff had built him a lightweight cart that strapped to his hips, a pair of small wheels that kicked up dust when he moved too fast. His coat was cleaner now, and he wore a red service dog vest with a patch that read, Guardian of Sophie. His eyes, though tinged with age, had not lost their fire. "All right, kids," called out a counselor, Nico Ortega, a tall, lean man in his late 20s with tanned skin, a long ponytail, and an easy smile. Nico had grown up near Helena and returned every summer to volunteer. His voice carried the kind of natural charisma that made even the most anxious child feel included. "Next game is called What Would You Do?" he announced. "Imagine you're lost in the woods, no adults around. What would you do first?" Hands shot up, voices overlapping. "I'd climb a tree. I'd look for a river. I'd wait for a helicopter." Nico chuckled, shaking his head. All right, let's go one by one. Sophie?" Sophie stood slowly, hands still clutching the whistle at her chest. "If I got lost," she said quietly, "I'd blow this." She held up the whistle. "Because I know someone would come find me." The clearing fell into a hush, not heavy, but soft and respectful. Even the younger kids stopped fidgeting. Sophie didn't cry, didn't tremble. She just smiled and sat down again, hands still resting on Rusty's back. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat and pulled his hat a little lower. Later that evening, as the kids roasted marshmallows under string lights wrapped around pine trunks, Sophie sat beside Jake at the edge of the fire ring. The stars were just beginning to show, and the embers cast dancing shadows on the ground. "I think I did okay today," Sophie said between bites of gooey marshmallow. "You were brave," Jake replied, passing her a bottle of water. "Rusty was watching me the whole time," she added. "He always does," Jake said, scratching the dog's ears. Rusty thumped his tail once against the dirt. Sophie leaned her head against Jake's shoulder. "I want to be like him." Jake turned to her, brows raised. "Like Rusty?" She nodded. "Loyal, quiet, brave when it matters, and someone who always knows where home is." Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back at the cabin a few days later, Sophie pinned her drawing to the refrigerator. A crude but colorful picture. A house under a hill, a dog with 3 legs sitting in the yard, and a man in a cowboy hat holding hands with a little girl. At the top she'd written, "Home isn't where you come from, it's who comes for you." Jake stared at the picture for a long time before opening the drawer by the sink and pulling out the tin whistle. It had cracked along one side now, the metal thinned with time and warmth, but it still made a sound. He cleaned it gently and laid it back where Sophie could always find it. That night, as Sophie fell asleep curled beside Rusty, Jake sat by the fire and scribbled something in his old notebook, a page he hadn't written in for over a year. The words were few, but they came easy now. "I thought war took everything from me. Turns out I just hadn't been found yet." This story reminds us that love isn't measured by blood, but by presence. A wounded dog, a lost girl, and a broken soldier found each other in a world that too often forgets the quiet, the hurt, and the overlooked. But in the warmth of a shared fire, in the sound of a little tin whistle, and in the loyalty of a dog who never stopped believing, they built something unshakable. Home. Maybe you've been Sophie, or Jake, or maybe you've known a Rusty, someone who stayed by your side when the road got rough. If this story touched your heart even a little, take a moment to comment "Amen" below. Not just for them, but for all the silent battles fought behind closed doors. Let this be a prayer for the forgotten, the wandering, the ones who almost gave up. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that they're not alone. Leave a comment if it made you feel something real. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories that matter most. And may God bless every heart watching this, especially the ones still waiting to be found.